Welcome to another story from the pages of Monster Hunter Quarterly. I'm Miles Booth, and tonight's report is from Harold Manwaring from the February 15th issue, 1930, in Harlem, New York City. In the hush of a dimly lit parlor in Harlem, a circle of the city's elite sat upon the edges of their velvet-cushioned chairs. The air was thick with the weight of recent financial calamity, and the members of the Lydia Lance Society gathered to summon guidance from beyond the veil. This society, a recently formed congregation of spiritualists, is part of a trend and practice that has seen a notable rise since the market's disastrous fall. Madame Jeffries, leader of this midnight gathering and half-owner of the Sidecar Club, served as medium and charged with communicating with the spirits. A frequent sight at her club, Jeffries has always been an enigmatic character, draped in the deep purples and blacks that have become her trademark attire. According to the lone survivor of the massacre, the flickering candlelight that evening cast Jeffries' angular features into sharp relief, creating an almost spectral visage and setting an ominous tone for the scene that would soon follow. Also among those seated was Reginald Hargrove, financier turned seeker of the supernatural after his empire buckled under the crash's relentless grip. Our witness noted that his usual impeccable suit seemed to hang heavier on his frame, as if weighed down by the invisible burden of his losses. His blue eyes, usually keen and discerning, flickered with desperation. The remaining members, unnamed, represented quiet affluence and influence. Real estate magnates, newspaper barons, and retail store owners, each one's fortune, once thought untouchable, now teetering precariously. As they sought solace in the otherworldly, their faces were etched with the same harrowed look of countless others across the city, who had witnessed their world change irreparably within the span of mere months. According to our witness, Madame Jeffries curtly announced that it was time to begin, her voice cutting through the silence like a cold draft. She extended her hands, palms upturned, beckoning the others to follow suit. One by one, the group joined hands, forming an unbroken chain around the table. As the clock struck midnight, the seance commenced. Madame Jeffries called to the spirit they had come to know as Lydia Lance, a guiding force that had come to the group some months previously. The group joined Jeffries in summoning the entity. "Lydia Lance, guide us," they intoned, voices laced with earnestness as they sought counsel from beyond the veil. The spectral advisor had garnered a reputation for prescience, her guidance thus far unmarred by falsehoods, her insights into matters of health and future events eerily accurate. Reginald Hargrove, whose sagacity in the realm of finance was unrivaled, implored the spirit for a beacon of hope, some semblance of direction through the dark forest of economic despair that loomed over them and the city. "Lydia, reveal to us the path through the shadow," Hargrove's voice resonated, a blend of his British origins and newfound humility. It was an appeal for personal salvation and for a lifeline that might yet salvage the splendor of New York itself. The silence that followed was pregnant with expectation, every member of the society acutely aware that the answers they sought from Lydia Lance this night could very well determine the fates of their empires and legacies. Madame Jeffries, slender as a shadow in her flowing gown of midnight hues, closed her eyes and let her head slowly drop toward the lacquered mahogany table. "Silence now," she commanded, as she prepared to join her consciousness with the ghost of Lydia Lance. A palpable current of electricity coursed through the group, yet it was not the spiritual energy they had so earnestly sought. Rules of the seance, a discipline of patience, respect, and order, had been discarded in their frantic grasping for salvation. Interruptions peppered the ritual, voices raised not in reverence, but in demand. "Tell us of the markets, spirit," implored a tycoon, his usual composure frayed to tatters. "Speak of the future, we beseech you," another pleaded, her diamonds glittering darkly in the low light as though mocking the faded luster of her financial standing. Enough! Madame Jeffrey's voice cracked like a whip, her eyes flashing open, alight with otherworldly fire. This sacred communication is not yours to command with the impatience of spoiled children. But her admonishment fell on deaf ears. The spiritual conduit they had opened, once guarded by ritual and respect, now teetered on the brink of chaos. It was a perilous gambit, for they had forgotten the most vital of truths. When one reaches into the unknown, it is paramount to be certain of what might reach back. The survivor reports that the air turned acrid as if charged with impending lightning, and Madame Jeffries was forcefully seized. The society members watched in abject horror as her slender form contorted in unnatural angles, her dark eyes rolling back to reveal only the whites. In a voice that was not her own, more a vibration that rattled the bones of all present, the entity spoke through the shuddering frame of Madame Jeffries. In a sepulchral voice, it stated that without their undivided energy and focus, it could not maintain its foothold in the physical realm. None of their questions would be answered. No guidance would be offered. "Please," implored the medium, her voice piercing the electrically charged atmosphere. Her plea was curt and laden with an urgency frayed with desperation. "Settle down and focus," she commanded, her angular features drawn tight, the shadows cast by the flickering candles dancing eerily across her face. The society members, previously murmuring with unease and excitement, fell into a tense silence. Their gaze locked onto Madame Jeffries, whose presence, even amidst the throes of spiritual assault, commanded obedience. And for a fleeting moment, it seemed that calm might be restored. But the serenity was not to last. "Enough of this," cried one member, his voice slicing through the thick atmosphere. "We demand answers now, spirit." The rest of the group, emboldened by the man's brash disregard for the established protocol of communication with the ethereal, chimed in with their own cacophony of questions, each more urgent than the last. Madame Jeffries, who up until this point had maintained some composure, began to show signs of distress as the spirit retaliated. The survivor recounted, seeing the medium's eyes roll back again, her slender body contorting unnaturally, as though she were a marionette under the control of an unseen puppeteer with cruel intentions. "It's twisting me," she gasped, under the tone laced with pain, as if the very fibers of her being were being wound tightly around the malevolent entity's spectral finger. The medium's sharp features, once the picture of stoic mystery, now twisted into an agonized mask as members of the society looked on with fear that none had ever witnessed such a violent display of otherworldly might. The group's clamor for immediate discourse abated, but it became evident that the cost of their collective impertinence would be far greater than any could have anticipated. The spirit tightened its grip on Madame Jeffrey's psyche, threatening to cast her into the abyss of madness as it sought to manifest fully into our corporeal world. What followed in that Harlem parlor is a tale too gruesome for the faint of heart, a stark reminder of the dangers that lurk when the veil between life and death is tampered with by those whose respect for the unknown is outweighed by a thirst for knowledge. The repercussions of this ill-fated seance will undoubtedly ripple through the spiritualist community for years to come. The entity, known as Lydia Lance, spoke through Jeffries. Its voice fell like icicles upon the room. "If you cannot bring forth the concentration required, then a blood offering will be necessary." The group, momentarily taken aback by the coldness emanating from their usually warm and guiding entity, understood the gravity of Lance's declaration. A few drops of blood from each participant, the spirit demanded, would tether it to the mortal coil, enabling the answers they so desperately sought to be delivered. Madame Jeffries, recovering slightly from her ordeal, nodded curtly. She knew the risks, but the spirit's insistence could not be ignored. A pact was made, sealed with the essence of life itself. The members of the society, driven by a desire that overshadowed their apprehension, prepared to make their offerings. The request for a blood offering was not met with the horror that it should have been. Instead, it was received as a necessary step towards unearthly enlightenment. They had ventured too far along the path of the unknown to turn back now, driven by an insatiable need for otherworldly knowledge and guidance. One of the society's members, whose identity remains concealed in the name of discretion, quickly retrieved a small crystal bowl. The vessel, elegant in its simplicity, glinted under the flickering candlelight. The bowl, placed reverently upon the mahogany table around which the group was gathered, waited silently to receive its crimson tribute. As the members of the society steeled themselves for what was to come, Madame Jeffries, her slender frame still echoing from the violent intrusion of the spirit, looked upon the members of the society with dark eyes. With a swift, almost theatrical flourish, Madame Jeffries produced from the depths of her voluminous robes a Kanjali dagger. Its blade glinted with a sinister promise in the candle's trembling light, and the society members watched with a mix of horror and fascination as the medium presented the instrument of their pact. "Your commitment," she said, but it was the spirit's voice that cut through the thick atmosphere of the room like the very steel she brandished. "Your commitment is needed." The group, once so eager for otherworldly communion, now found themselves ensnared by the gravity of their own curiosity. They shifted uneasily, exchanging wary glances as they reached a silent consensus. One by one, they extended trembling hands toward the dagger's edge. From right to left, each member drew the blade across their own fingertip, a soft drip, 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 filling the room as blood splashed into the bowl. This ritualistic offering, a bond sealed in blood, marked the point of no return for the assembly. Madame Jeffries observed the proceedings with an impassive gaze, any hint of trepidation trapped behind a face that now wore the spirit's expression. The members, compelled by something beyond their understanding, had cast their lot. A hush fell over the assembly as Madame Jeffries lifted the crystal bowl to her lips. The members of the Lydia Lance Society stood motionless, their anticipation palpable in the thick air, a collective breath held in dread and fascination. Only the flickering candles disturbed the stillness, casting shadows that danced macabrely upon the walls. As the last drop was drained, the room became a tomb of silence, the kind that presses against the eardrums and quickens the heart. For a moment, nothing stirred save for the medium's throat, which began to tremble subtly. A low moan emanated from within her, the sound muffled at first, as if it clawed its way up from the depths of an abyss. Then, growing louder, it warped into a resonance that chilled the soul, a cry not of this world, a wail that bespoke of malevolence. Madame Jeffries now became contorted by the invading presence. Her eyes widened in unspeakable terror, the lines of her face twisted into an expression that the survivor described as otherworldly agony. The members of the society now found themselves witness to a horror that their curiosity had birthed. The moaning shattered the deathly silence as it pierced through the smoke-laden air of the parapet, warning all present that the entity that they had sought to commune with was not the peaceful spirit of Lydia Lance, but something far more sinister. In what the lone survivor described as a sudden and malevolent transformation, the once composed Madame Jeffries lunged forward with a preternatural swiftness. With the precision of an executioner, she grasped the Kanjali dagger and in one swift, horrifying motion, slit the throat of a woman seated nearest to her. The victim, whose name is being withheld at the request of her family, collapsed onto the floor, her lifeblood spilling out upon the Persian rug that adorned the chamber. Panic ensued within the parlor, but the entity possessing Madame Jeffries had only begun its grim harvest. Like a marionette jerked by unseen strings, the medium flew across the table, her gown billowing like the wings of some dark angel of death. Members of the society scrambled away in terror, but their efforts proved futile against the relentless assault. One after another, more throats were savagely opened by the frenzied hands of Jeffries. She gripped the lapels of jackets and the silk gowns, pulling her victims close as the dagger found its mark time and again. Crimson splashed across the mahogany table and accoutrements, transforming the seance into a scene from a slaughterhouse. The still living members of the society scrambled towards the room's exit, only to find themselves entrapped. They pounded their fists against the stout oak door that had swung so welcomingly upon their entrance hours earlier. Yet it remained unmoved, indifferent to the desperate shoves and shoulder rams from the men. The cacophony of their collective terror should have woken the entire block, yet it seemed stifled, as if the room itself had absorbed each shriek and every plea. Reginald Hargrove, now reduced to a man caught in the grips of fear, shouted commands that fell on deaf ears as if the great vacuum had enveloped a space, swallowing sound whole and leaving behind a void where not even the anguished screams of the doomed could escape. In an act of desperate valor, Hargrove, along with another gentleman of the society, lunged forward to grapple with the malevolent force that had taken hold of Madame Jeffries, and the two men sought to wrest the deadly blade from the medium's grasp. With a sudden jarring motion, the pair succeeded. The Kanjali dagger slipped from the medium's fingers as if relinquishing itself from the unnatural strength. Reginald Hargrove, financier turned inadvertent hero, stood panting, the cold steel of the weapon now in his trembling hand. "Madam," he addressed the twisted figure before him, though it was clear that the woman they knew had vacated herself to something far more sinister. He hesitated, but the sight of the bloodied innocents strewn about solidified his resolve. In one swift moment, driven by necessity rather than malice, Mr. Hargrove plunged the dagger into the heart of Madame Jeffries. Her body, which moments ago contorted with the ferocity of the spirit within, fell limp, and the room released its breath in a collective gasp. But the stillness of the aftermath was abruptly shattered by a sound that cleaved through the dead-soaked air. A laugh. Not the laugh of Madame Jeffries, the once respected medium of Harlem's Lydia Lance Society, but an eerie, shrill cackle that emanated from her prone body. It was as if the very shadows mocked their futile attempts at heroism. "Reginald," the voice hissed with otherworldly command, "turn the blade upon thyself." The two survivors of the once eager assembly watched, paralyzed, as the man who breached the veil between life and death with his own hand obeyed. With a look of anguished resignation, Reginald Hargrove, his will overpowered by the malignant spirit, directed the dagger to his chest, and with a trembling hand, he slowly pushed the blade into his own heart until it was buried. With a hollow thud, he collapsed beside the form of Madame Jeffries. The room, now a crypt of secrets and whispers, held but three trembling souls. Before they could process the horror of Mr. Hargrove's deed, Madame Jeffries, animated anew by the sinister entity, regained possession of the Kanjali. With a tormented grace, she rose. The remaining gentlemen, whose name will soon be etched in the tragic history of this Valentine's Day seance, stood mouth agape. Perhaps it was shock, perhaps it was disbelief, that froze him to his spot. In a flash of silver, his fate was sealed, the dagger drawn across his throat by hands that were no longer those of Madame Jeffries, but rather conduits for the vengeful spirit. In the final act of his grotesque spectacle, the medium, now a vessel for the malevolent force, faltered. Her breath grew labored. The once deft hands that had so cruelly brandished the Kanjali dagger trembled. With a gasp, she clutched at her chest, where crimson blossomed through the fabric of her ceremonial robes like a rose unfolding and fast forward. It was then that the unholy strength abandoned her. Madame Jeffries teetered, a marionette with severed strings, before collapsing in a heap upon the Persian rug that had earlier been the stage for her sinister performance. The dagger slid from her grasp, with a sound that seemed to echo the finality of her demise. A lone survivor stood amidst the carnage, her face a ghostly mask of horror. She alone would bear witness to the night's grim unraveling. As this investigation unfolds, one question lingers in the minds of all. What malevolent spirit crossed the threshold on that fateful Valentine's Day? To answer this question, another group has been contacted. The Allagash Brotherhood and Shrine of Bangor, Maine. The Allagash Brotherhood has long been a respected spiritualist society, led by the spirit of an ancestor to the family that has guided the society for generations. Upon our request, a member of the Brotherhood agreed to speak with Monster Hunter Quarterly. Mr. Edward William Bach, member since 1892, listened to my recounting of the tale, and from his sighs I knew he recognized mistake after mistake in the Lydia Lance Society's methods. All too often a spirit masquerading as a benevolent soul will take advantage of the uninitiated. He paused, silent for the sound of a pencil scratching upon paper, before stating, "See here, the name Lydia Lance can quickly be rearranged to spell another name. Alanand Dise. This is a name found in several texts known to be malevolent. This was a mistake that would have been easy to avoid had their medium truly known her craft." The Lydia Lance Society did possess a supposed photograph of a living Lydia Lance, but there's been no confirmation yet of the photograph's origin or if the woman in question was indeed Lydia Lance. As always, if anyone recognizes the photo as it has been published in Monster Hunter Quarterly, please contact us at your earliest convenience. As to be expected, Tensor and Moss quickly but quietly stepped in to acquire the dagger for safekeeping, and the city of New York will be conducting an official exorcism of the Harlem residents as soon as possible. The property, including both the club and the residents, are currently barred from any public usage. That concludes this report for Monster Hunter Quarterly. This is Harold Menwaring, signing off.